DeepSeek is really shaking things up in the LLM space because many people are starting to realize that there is no competitive advantage. And as a student of economics who teaches in graduate MBA programs, I would have to bring up the classic case of the chef that is in a mountain town. Let's say there's three restaurants, and a famous chef decides to come to that mountain town, and everybody starts to go to one restaurant because the chef is making amazing food. Well, what happens is eventually one of the other restaurants decides that they want to pay the chef more money because they realize that there are big problems with the traffic going to the restaurant. Nobody goes to the restaurant anymore. And then eventually the third restaurant decides as well to bring the chef into their restaurant. So what's happening, this is perfect competition. Everybody is going after this same resource, and eventually all of the profit goes to the chef. So this is a simplified version of in perfect competition, all profit leads to zero, because there's no competitive advantage other than the chef. Likewise, inside of the LLM world, a good place to take a look at this in real time is Chatbot Arena. If you go to lm.arena.ai, you can see that constantly different models, commercial models, open models, are exchanging different places in the arena score. So we have Gemini, DeepSeek R1, O1 Mini, Claude, DeepSeek, Quinn. And what this means as well is it's a similar scenario where there really isn't something different that one provider can do versus another. They all have access to similar things, GPUs, data, etc. As we start to see different techniques surface, maybe smaller models or different refinements will happen. And if you look at the ELO rating itself, it's probably worth talking a little bit about what that does and how it's used historically. So ELO rating is a strength of schedule metric. So what it's typically done for the chess world is it shows that if a very tough chess opponent plays another very tough opponent, they would have a higher score than if they played a very low ranking opponent. So it shows you how very competitive opponents will actually compete against each other. You've also seen it play out in things like UFC, for example. I've done a little bit of work with that where I've looked at two different UFC fighters, and you'll see that maybe one has an extremely high ELO rating temporarily because they've actually beat all of the very good opponents. So in that case, the ELO rating would justify that, wow, this is an opponent that people haven't figured out yet, the different fighting techniques they're doing, the grappling or the striking or the combination of all those, and they'll have an extremely high ELO rating. But over time, what you'll see is there'll be a parity where, again, just like the chef in the mountain town, that eventually people are exchanging it. And you see this sometimes in UFC, for example, in, let's say, a middleweight or a lighter weight class where there's so many different opponents where maybe every time there's a competition, a different opponent becomes the champion because it's just so difficult to have any competitive advantage. Everybody knows the same types of techniques. So that's really the history of the ELO and why it's a pretty good way to look at these large language models. And so eventually, what does this mean? It means that probably 2025, 2026, we're going to see more and more companies realize that, spending more money on GPUs or, hiring the most expensive research engineers is not going to play a significant role, and that more likely we'll see a scenario in technology that pans out like Linux. And let me talk a little bit about why I think that scenario could pan out based on my own career. So in 2000, I started working at Caltech in IT, and that was in the heyday of things like Solaris. And Solaris was a proprietary operating system that was really amazing. In fact, many universities used it because you could have 50,000 users on a Solaris cluster, and it was an impressive proprietary Unix operating system. But open source started to come into play, and it wasn't as good. And this is what's a little bit surprising about open source, and we see this as well with open models, is that you don't have to actually be better, you just have to be good enough. What this means is that with Linux in the early 2000s, it started to get good enough, and then people were wondering, why am I spending all this money on Unix and having these expensive machines and hardware, even though they're better, how much better they are really doesn't justify the cost. We can use something that's not as good, but that's free. And that's why today, 2025, you see that almost 100% of the server deployments are using a free Linux deployment operating system. And Windows is really a niche product. And potentially maybe Windows Server even disappears at some point because there isn't a huge demand for it. So likewise, currently we have a lot of people using these commercial models like ChatGPT, but is it possible in the future we won't have any models that are proprietary that people use? Well, here's a few reasons why there could be a emphasis on local models. One is that you're sending data to some organization, and it could be illegal, right? If you're sending legal data or you're sending medical data, it actually could be against the law to send that to some third-party company. You don't know what they're doing with it. We also have the concept of the law of large data breaches, which I would classify as eventually all data is leaked. So we have seen that eventually most data that lives on a website somewhere gets breached, or some subset of it gets breached. So why would you be putting all this data somewhere where eventually it could get breached? What we're probably going to see is that the profit will go to zero. And so likely people will probably run local models on their machines, or potentially there could be like open source models, like a Wikipedia kind of model that again is free. And so the future really is not going to be these commercial models that are AGI or artificial general intelligence. I think the consensus for many people that are involved in generative AI is they know that that's just a way of marketing things so that people feel like things are getting better and better and better. What we've seen is that just like the UFC fighter, where they're constantly exchanging who's the champion, we're going to see this with models. So why would you put all of your data into one model when maybe they go bankrupt, right? Or maybe that company becomes less trustworthy. Likewise, what we'll see is that there'll be more of an embrace on open models, local models. And so I think that's what we're going to see in the space of the large language models, is in perfect competition, all profit will lead to zero.